So good evening, everyone. I'm State Senator Robert Jackson, representing the 31st Senate District in Manhattan. And I thank you all for joining this virtual town hall on the education budget, adequately titled The Real Deal. Today, we aim to provide facts and data to help many concerned families, educators, students, and school staff members better understand the current education budget. As many of you know, I am not only a state senator, I also join you today as a proud parent and education advocate for over 3 decades who walked 150 miles from New York City to Albany twice for the fair and equitable funding of our schools. And many have heard me state that quality education is a pillar in interrupting community violence and uplifting all in our neighborhoods. And like you, I am very concerned and disappointed with the school budget cuts, especially knowing that the money is there. I know this because at the state legislature, in which I'm part of it, we passed a budget to fully fund our schools. New York City had a record high budget this year, yet the city decided to cut education funding by nearly $215 million. This cut, on top of the loss of $400 million in federal funding for education, will further disenfranchise students, families, and educators in working class communities like those in School District 6. Many in our school community know these cuts ignore the daily crisis our young people are experiencing and have loudly expressed it. They are demanding funding be restored and specified how they should be invested. Small class size, more community schools, citywide restorative justice, culturally responsive and sustainable education, support for our students with disabilities and English language learners, art and music, after-school programs, and so much more. The money is there, and it's all about priorities. And our focus is to fully fund our schools. As schools received an influx of migrants and other cities grapple with a high number of families who experience homelessness, our principals, teachers, mental health professionals, therapists, school staff are implementing heroic efforts to support our students. But they need help. They need the funding to be restored and more. Without further ado, let's get this started. Let's find out what the real deal is with the current school budget. And I'd like to introduce Joanna Garcia, our Chief of Staff that will be emceeing this evening. Joanna.
Thank you, Senator Jackson. And again, good evening to everyone, and thank you for attending. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce and welcome our panelists. With us today, we have the Independent Budget Office, also known as the IBO. And the IBO is a publicly funded independent city agency that provides nonpartisan information on the New York City budget and economy. Sarita Subramanian is the Assistant Director for Education, and Taina Guarda is a Senior Budget and Policy Analyst for Education. We're also joined by Jasmine Gripper, who is the Executive Director at the Alliance for Quality Education, AQE. As a former teacher with a passion for grassroots organizing, she is working to dismantle systemic racism in the education system. We're also joined by Lainey Hameson, who is the Executive Director of Class Size Matters and the co-chair of the Parent Coalition for Student Privacy, and a longtime advocate for smaller classes in the city schools. Dr. Kaliri Salas Ramirez, who will be joining us a little later in the program, is the Manhattan Borough President appointee to the Panel for Education, also known as the PEP, a distinguished medical lecturer at the CUNY School of Medicine, former president of CEC4, and a community organizer that elevates the voices of parents and students. We also have with us tonight Karima Kauja, who is a parent representative for PSIS 187 Hudson Cliffs School Leadership Team. Many of us know it better as SLT, and she is also co-president for the Friends of 187 Parent Group. With us today, we also have Carmen Rojas, who is the founder of PAN, Padres Abogando para Nuestros Niños, which means parents advocating for our children. We are also joined by Luis Camilo, who is the president of District 6 President's Council. And I don't think we've been joined by CEC 6 President Lisandra Sanchez, but she may be joining us a little later in the program. Now, let's begin. I am now going to turn the program over to IBO, Independent Budget Office. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. My part of the presentation is going to be focusing on introducing the key terms that are used specifically to with regards to the education budget, the DOE. And so I'm going to start by just defining what is a budget. So the literal definition of a budget is a financial plan setting forth operating expenditures, anticipated revenue, and any other anticipated sources and uses of funds. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so what that means is it's also, because of the way that funds are distributed, it's also a statement of priorities and shows what those priorities are. The next slide, please. So I'm going to go over some definitions and acronyms that you might hear in discussions about the budget. The first is allocated funds. So funds are considered allocated when the central DOE issues an allocation memorandum, which signals an intent to create a budget. And an allocation category is a bucket of money designated by the Department of Education. Now, this can be for a program or for a specific funding source. ATR, or absence reserve, stands for the absent teacher reserve. And the reserve is a holding place for excess teachers and other school-based positions. Budgeted versus spent. So budgeted funds reflect a plan or an intent to spend money, and spent funds reflect an expenditure for either a salary for personnel, a good, or a service. Categorical programs, it describes programs that are funded with either state or federal dollars that oblige certain reporting requirements, and that's to distinguish them from city funds. The CEP is an acronym for the Comprehensive Education Plan, and it's a school strategy about its students' achievement along with funding that supports those strategies. FSF is an acronym for the Fair Student Funding Formula, and this is the Department of Education, the New York City Department of Education's methodology to allocate the largest amount of discretionary funds to schools. And it's based on student enrollment and also the needs of the students that the school serves. It's also the name of several allocation categories. Next slide, please. Funding source is revenue that supports expenditures. Galaxy is the name for the New York City school budgeting system. This is the system that most schools in districts 1 through 32 are funded by. And Galaxy budget allocations are buckets of money for specific purposes that are identified in the school allocation memorandum. OTPS stands for Other Than Personal Services, which are expenditures such as goods and services. PEP, or the Panel for Educational Policy, is DOE's 23-member authorizing body for the budget and contract spending in New York City public schools. PS stands for personal services, and this is in contrast to other than personal services, which I mentioned. And so these are expenditures such as position and related fringe benefit expenditures. Reimbursables is another way that categorical programs are referred to. And again, this is a state or federal program or funding source that requires an upfront expenditure with the expectation that there will later be reimbursement. Revenue sources are types of money that pay for expenditures. Next slide, please. A SAM is a common term that you might hear, and this stands for School Allocation Memorandum. And this is a list of every dollar that's allocated to schools. The list of allocation memos is published on the DOE website, and I've included a link here. And a little bit later, I'm going to show you what those look like. Each allocation has its own SAM that contain the allocation funding, the scheduling of funds, and the programmatic details. Scheduled funds are budget funds that have been placed on specific budget lines. So once the central DOE allocates the funds, then schools schedule the funds on specific budget lines. The school budget summary is a list of every school position or OTPS spending and its associated budget amount. SLT stands for the school leadership team that my fellow presenters are going to talk about a little bit more in detail later. And tax levy is a type of funding source with few requirements that is based on revenue from the city. So this is to distinguish tax levy sources of funding from federal sources of funding, categorical funding. Next slide, please. And so this is a snapshot of what the main school allocation memorandum page looks like. And I'm going to try to share my screen and show you. Oh, I'm not able to share my screen actually. But if you follow the link that's included in this presentation, it will take you to the school allocation memorandum page, and you can see the list of every SAM. And to give you some perspective, for the last school year, there were 100 SAMs issued, and that's money that's dedicated to schools from central administration. SAMs are generally released in June for the following school year. So that's a preliminary budget that schools can start out with, and they can be issued throughout the year so that by the end of the year, there can be up to 100 SAMs issued for, as I mentioned, particular programs or funding sources. So now I'll turn it back over to Joanna.
Thank you. I want to do some quick retroactive housekeeping. All of the slides that are being presented tonight are going to be emailed to everyone that registered with us, both in English and in Spanish. So everything has been translated. And we do have a space in our agenda for Q&A, and we ask that if questions pop up as you hear as you listen to the presenters, please feel free to use the Q&A tab to put in your questions. And then when we get to the Q&A portion, we will certainly direct those questions to the appropriate panelist. Thank you. Oh, and one more thing, and this has to do with translation interpretation. It helps, and I suppose this is for the panelists, if we just slow down a little bit as we speak, so that the translator, the interpreter has a chance to keep up and interpret what we're saying. Okay, so with that, I'm happy to introduce again, Jasmine Gripper, Executive Director of Alliance for Quality Education, who will talk to us about how the state budget connects with the city budget. Take it away, Jasmine.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Senator Jackson, for hosting this forum on tonight. I just want to say I am a proud product of the New York City Public Schools, from kindergarten to CUNY, a former educator in the system, and used to work in a New York City school myself. And AQE has been fighting hard against the budget cuts that have happened at the city level. And just to put things in context, as Senator Jackson mentioned in the very beginning, we fought long and hard to get Albany to finally deliver on the state aid that was owed to our children. In 2021, New York State made a commitment to finally fully fund the state's own equitable school funding formula called Foundation Aid. So in 2021, New York State increased aid to New York City schools by $530 million. And then again in 2022, New York State added an additional $309 million to New York City schools. This is an increase year over year from what New York City had before. So when the mayor says that Albany is failing our students, he is telling a lie. Albany is doing its part and is on track to continue to fully fund our schools. And we expect another increase in state aid from Albany coming up next year. In addition to the money that we receive from the state, I also want to point out that the federal government has stepped in big to help New York City and to help our schools. In the midst of the pandemic, the federal government allocated nearly $7 billion to New York City just for education. That does not count the federal aid from the pandemic that came for other areas or other categories of spending. Just for the New York City DOE, there was $7 billion additional dollars from the federal government. Now, this is different because the federal funding is one-time aid. But the other thing was the federal government said New York City had 3 years to spend the money. And from all reports that we see from both the IBO and the New York City Comptroller, New York City still has unspent federal aid that it could use right now to make sure our schools are fully funded. And so one of the things that, Sarita mentioned was about budgets. I just want to add to that budgets are about priorities. If we prioritize our children, we will find the money to fund our schools. We live in New York City. We live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We live in one of the wealthiest states in the US, and we live in one of the wealthiest cities anywhere. If you want to look at the economy of New York City, you do not compare it to other cities across the US. You actually compare it to other countries. That is how much wealth exists in New York City. When New York State made the commitment to fully fund our schools, what the state did was it increased taxes on the ultra rich as a way to raise revenue to make sure the dollars were there to support our children. This mayor is making a choice to cut funding from public education. He did not have to do it. The state did not shortchange the city, and the federal government has provided more than enough funds. Again, according to the comptroller, we know that New York City schools lost about more than 469 million in cuts that went directly to our schools. That meant our schools had to let go of teachers. They had to let go of literacy coaches. They had to let go of counselors and other support staff that we know are crucial to the recovery of children, especially from the COVID-19 pandemic. The other thing that the city has been, I think, misinforming people about is the Fair Student Funding formula. So New York State has a formula called Foundation Aid to drive money to the city. New York City has its own formula called Fair Student Funding to distribute aid across the city schools. The formula is not perfect, but it is mostly equitable. There is currently a task force working on recommendations to update the city's Fair Student Funding formula. But I want to caution, even as the co-chair of that task force, that those tweaks will not fix this crisis. They are only tweaks to help make the formula more equitable. If the city wants to make sure our schools are made whole, if they want to make sure we have enough teachers in the classroom to support reducing class sizes, if they want to make sure we have more guidance counselors and more literacy coaches and more math coaches in our schools, the city needs to invest more dollars into education. I don't think anyone believes that our schools have more than enough in this moment. And if anything, We know our kids deserve and need a lot more in order to have a holistic and high quality education. And so it is our responsibility, and I thank Senator Jackson for hosting this forum, for getting the facts straight and pulling together the experts to share with you all that New York City needs to prioritize our children in our recovery. We need to invest in education now. It is a strategy of keeping our city safer when kids have a place to go, when they are well educated, when we can disrupt the school to prison pipeline. We need more support staff in our school buildings, not less. And we need an urgent commitment to reduce class sizes. And again, the state passed a mandate to reduce class sizes while giving the city more funds in foundation aid. And the state is expected to continue to increase foundation aid to New York City in the upcoming years. And so we applaud Senator Jackson and the state legislature for doing their part. And we need to hold New York City Council and New York City Mayor accountable to do their part. And we need them to fully fund our schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I really think that it's important for parents and educators and advocates to understand the whole kind of disconnect between our schools were fully funded by the state, and yet there are conversations every day in our schools about budget cuts and what that looks like in real time. So continuing with our real talk and really helping people understand what happened, we're now going to turn it to Lainey Hainson from Class Size Matters, who's going to talk to us and walk through the budget cuts, what happened, and unfortunately what may be coming. Lainey?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to be providing a lot of data about the city as a whole and District 6 in particular. And as Joanna said, this PowerPoint will be available later, so you don't have to take notes or remember all the particulars. So please, let's go. A lot of slides here. So last year, class sizes fell dramatically across many schools. Why? Enrollment was declining. For the first time, school budgets were not tied to enrollment. There was additional federal funding for COVID relief. And we did a survey and some follow-up interviews, and many parents and teachers said the conditions were ideal for the first time in their schools because students were getting the support from their teachers that they really needed, both academically and social emotionally, to recover from the disruptions that had occurred because of the pandemic. Next slide. So this is what happened last year in terms of class sizes. The blue line is the citywide average. The orange line is what happened in District 6. The yellow line is the caps, which we will get to soon, the caps in the new class size law. So the caps are going to be 20 kids per class in K through 3. And you can see in District 6, the averages were 19.6, which is under the cap, and under what the citywide average was 21.2. And you see it went way down the year before, but that's not fully accurate because it only reflects the in-person classes. And as you know, 60% of students stayed home for blended learning or for complete remote learning. So that has a little asterisk with it. But class sizes did fall last year to much lower levels and really very beneficial levels for students. Next slide. That's K through 3. This is 4 through 8. You can see again, District 6 had class sizes averaged at 20, which is below the caps in the law and quite far below the citywide average of 24. Next slide. This is the high school averages. This is citywide. We didn't do it directly for District 6, but it was 24.7 on average across the city, which is below the 25 that we're aiming for as class size caps. Next slide. So at the same time as a lot of schools enjoyed smaller classes, more than 180,000 students were still crammed into classes of 30 or more, especially at the high school level. And this is a minimum because we only counted social studies classes that large. For high school, we didn't want to double count students. So the real numbers was much more than that. But there's still many high schools last year which had very large classes. Next slide. So class sizes were unequal across the city. You can see the yellow line is District 6, the green line is the citywide average, and then there are a lot of districts up here, especially in Queens, where class sizes were much larger. Next slide. 22, you can see District 6 was the 10th lowest average class sizes. The green is 24, the citywide average. And again, a lot of classes that were above the average in the Bronx, in Manhattan, and especially in Staten Island and Queens. Next slide. And this is high school. So your high schools in District 6 were just about the citywide average of 24.7, 24.8. Next slide. So as I mentioned, and you may have heard, it was very exciting. A new class size law was passed last spring, overwhelmingly by the legislature. I want to give a lot of credit to Robert Jackson because he was the first one to introduce this bill the year before in the state Senate. And I honestly can say for sure, this bill would have never passed the legislature without his absolutely passionate advocacy for this bill. So he deserves a huge round of appreciation from all parents and students and teachers in New York City. And Joanna Garcia was also very key in keeping her eye on the ball. So this was a huge, huge thing that many of us have been working for 20 years. The issue of class size actually goes back to the 1930s and Mayor Jimmy Walker's administration, where it was already seen as the most important problem in New York City schools. This fall, the governor signed the bill with one change. She said that the phase-in will begin next fall instead of this fall. And what the law requires is that over the next 5 years, starting next fall, 1/5 of all classes should have to reach the following caps: of 20 in K through 3, 23 in 4 through 8, and 25 in high school, with an additional 20% every year, until those caps should be achieved citywide by the end of the 2027-28 school year. And the city is supposed to prioritize high poverty schools first to reduce class size. And as we've seen last year, almost half of all classes reached those levels. So it's very possible, given current enrollment, given enrollment of last year and funding, that we could make the first few years of that phase-in, but there's more work that would need to be done to reach it citywide. Next slide. So yeah, citywide last year, 41% of all classes citywide were at or below the target class size caps in the law. I'm trying to figure out what this chart means, and I'm not sure now what it is. It's total number of classes that were met the cap, and I'm not sure what these numbers mean. If someone else can interpret them, I think it has the wrong x-axis, but I'll fix it for the posted version. But 41% of classes met their target. Next slide. And then 53% of classes in District 6 made their targets. Next slide. But this year, as you've already heard, there have been big budget cuts to schools, which we expect will have caused class sizes to go up substantially in most schools. Budgets were cut because they were tied again to fair student funding, which is tied to enrollment. Federal funds were also cut sharply, the federal COVID funds, about $1 billion, even though New York City still has about $4 billion in federal funds, COVID funds in reserve. As again, this led to lots of teachers being let go, lots of critical programs eliminated, art and music classes eliminated, counselors let go, social workers and classroom teachers, either excess or retiring teachers not replaced. Next slide. So how much were schools cut? The city controller said found 77% of schools had their fair student funding cut by about $470 million. We looked at District 6 schools in particular. Your schools were cut fair student funding by about $11 million. We also looked at the entire Galaxy budgets, which is the entire school budget. And as of the end of September, citywide school budgets were cut by about $1 billion, and in District 6 by $26 million. Parents and teachers filed a lawsuit, you might have heard, in July to try to get the budget cuts restored because the budgets were cut in an illegal manner by the city council before the panel for educational policy had a chance to vote, which violates state law. That lawsuit we won at the Supreme Court level, which is the lowest level, but then the city appealed and it's still sitting in the appellate court right now without a decision. Next slide. More cuts are planned. This is really important. We should be talking about this as well. Many schools are facing mid-year budget cuts due to even lower enrollment than projected. DOE was already planning to make additional cuts to schools of another $80 million next school year. And now the mayor has ordered all city agencies, including the DOE, to make additional mid-year cuts of 3% and 4.75% in each of the following 3 years. And honestly, class size reduction will be impossible to achieve with cuts this large. Next slide. So one of the things we also have been concerned about was that the adopted school capital plan, which we rely on to build enough schools, especially in overcrowded districts, was cut by $1.5 billion for new capacity compared last spring compared to the adopted plan the year before. More than 11,000 seats were cut. And yet, according to last year's Blue Book, 38% of students were still in overcrowded schools, over 100%. And likely there will not be enough space to lower class size, especially in overcrowded school districts, without a more transparent and a better funded capital plan, and also changes in admissions policies, which I will get to in a second. Next slide. So here are the capital plan cuts of new seats by districts. You can see that there were a lot. Again, for some reason, the district numbers are cut at the bottom. Sorry about that. You have no seats cut in District 6 only because you have no seats to be built in District 6 in the capital plan. Next slide. Why did they make so many cuts to the capital plan? They didn't really explain, but we assume it's because of the enrollment decline, which DOE expects to continue into the future. But there was also cuts because they changed the Blue Book formula, the efficiency ratio, which assumes how many periods a day classrooms are going to be full. So previously, regular classrooms were expected to be in use 7 of 8 periods a day in middle schools and high schools, specialty rooms like dance rooms, music rooms, science labs, 5 of 8 periods a day. But now all middle school and high schools rooms are expected to be full and scheduled 100% of the day, which is impossible to achieve. For example, if you have a dance room or a music room, you cannot schedule that as a regular classroom. Say when the music or art teacher is on her prep period or having lunch, you cannot make it into a regular classroom. And for even regular classrooms are very difficult for smaller schools to schedule 100% of the time. But this one change artificially added over 2,500 seats to middle schools and over 20,000 seats to high schools without the school construction authority adding an actual school building or annex. It was an artificial manipulation of the formula to look like there's more space than there actually is in our schools. Next slide. So by looking at the Blue Book, we need about 48,000 seats, and even District 6, you can see in yellow, needs about 700 seats in overcrowded schools. Next slide. And these are also estimates we've done about new development, because the DOE supposedly takes into account new development and uses a ratio to then project how many students will be generated by new residential developments, and it's supposed to be taking that into account in their capital plan from housing starts, and yet we have no way of knowing exactly how they're taking that into account at all. But we estimate that about 40,000 seats are needed from new development alone. Next slide. So one of the things that we really believe needs to change is the way enrollment is distributed across schools. So this is District 6, and you can see that there's some schools where they're as low as 27% utilized, and other schools where they're 147% utilized. And that disparity runs across the entire district, and that's very typical of the city as a whole. And obviously, if you're going to be trying to cap class sizes across the city in all schools, it would be far better to equitably distribute kids in schools across the city, because the average utilization is about 85%, which is the goal that we should be moving to. We also did an analysis looking at the demography, and the schools that tend to be very underutilized tend to have higher levels of Black and Latinx students, and the schools that are overcrowded tend to have higher numbers and percentages of white and Asian students. We believe that if enrollment was more equitably distributed, that would also lead to more diversity in our schools, which would be a good thing. Next slide. In your district in particular, 10 of your 46 schools are over 100%, enrolling about 30% of the total, and that's 8 of them are elementary schools. So there may need to be some rezoning as well. Next slide. So one of the things that we've been pushing for recently is we believe there needs to be a task force created to come up with a plan to reduce class sizes now. We need to look at the capital plan carefully to see how many seats are actually needed. We need to look at the admissions policies. We need to make sure that the budget in future years is adequate to allow for the staffing and the hiring of extra teachers to reduce class sizes. One of the changes in the law that was made at the very end of the session that we had no input in was that it said that the plan would be developed solely by the DOE in collaboration with the UFT and the CSA, which is the principals union. But we believe that parents, advocates, students, and local elected officials need to be included as well. We need to make sure that the DOE is taking all these things into account seriously and that our voices are heard. CPAC, the Chancellor's Parent Advisory Council, and several CECs have already passed resolutions in favor of this task force. We also have a letter. We'll share the link with you at the end for other organizations and CECs to sign. And we're making a really big push for this. CPAC already has been asking the Chancellor about this, and other organizations have been as well. So we need a big push, but the planning really needs to start now. Next slide. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lainey. So folks, at the beginning of this presentation, we did have the IBO talk and walk through a glossary, and Lainey used the word utilize or utilization a lot. Lainey, can you explain what you mean every time you say utilization of space?
Right. So every year there's a report that's put out that claims to say how schools are being utilized. And basically what it is the DOE decides what the capacity of that school is in terms of classroom space and other auxiliary space. And so how many students should comfortably fit in that school. And then they also report on the enrollment of that school. And so the utilization rate is the enrollment over the capacity. So schools that are seen to be over 100%, and we have many, many schools that are way over 100% across the city, means that the enrollment is much higher than the capacity of that school. And what that means is that you have overcrowded classrooms, you have kids receiving their special services in hallways and closets. Many high schools are on double or triple shifts, which means some kids start as early in the morning as 7 a.m. and others end as late as 5 p.m. in the afternoon. And really a lot of those schools are crammed to the gills with students that kids can barely pass each other in the hallways. And so to me, it's extremely inequitable, but also inefficient and bad policy to have so many schools that are underutilized and so many schools that are overutilized. And since the DOE really pretty much controls middle school and high school admissions, except for a few zone schools, this is something that is completely under their control. And in terms of zoned elementary schools, they could also do a lot more rezoning to try to equalize enrollment across all schools. But still, there are going to be certain communities where all the schools are so overcrowded that we need to build more schools. It takes about 5 years to site and build a school, and that's why we need to start the planning now.
Thank you, Lainey. I'm going to take moderator's privilege right now and extend some kindness to our interpreter who has been translating for quite a bit. And if you all don't mind, we're just gonna give a 1-minute rest to Magda, who has been translating, so she can rest her voice. In the meantime, if you have questions, right now is a good time to put that in the chat. Just a minute, folks. Thank you. Okay, we're going to start again. So we've heard the usual terms used for all those acronyms that are thrown at parents and educators about our children's education. We heard how the state plays a role in actually fully funding our schools and the connection to funding our schools at a city level. And we just heard how at the city level, there were budget cuts that are impacted and also do influence equity, enrollment, as well as other programming such as class size. We are now going to talk about what sometimes parents don't think about. Sometimes when we think about the Department of Education and who controls what happens in our schools, we think principal, if you know, the superintendent and chancellor. But there are other bodies, there are other groups that actually are part of school governance. And it's very important for parents to understand how these bodies move and have play a role in the school budget, because there is where most parents and educators can find that they too have a voice in how our schools are funded. And so with that, I'm going to turn it to Karima, who is a parent of public school children and sits on the SLT, School Leadership Team at PSIS 187. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I'd also like to start off by saying thank you to all of the amazing leaders and advocates on this call. Thank you for your tireless and passionate work that you do every day. And for this very informative session. As a parent, I can say it's very intimidating to kind of follow all of the different news surrounding budget cuts and city and state laws. So this is very informative, and knowledge is power. And I think now more than ever, we have to act as a village, whether it's a top-down and bottoms-up approach, coming together, really empowering ourselves, encouraging our fellow parents, not only in our schools, but across our district and citywide, to come together and really understand what we have accessible to us in terms of advocating for our children. Again, not only in our schools, I stand here as a parent of children at PSIS 187, 2 daughters, but also I care deeply about District 6 and all of the children in New York City schools. It's very concerning as a parent to read and kind of sift through all of the news around the budget cuts, specifically for our school and in our district. I know there's a lot of schools that have been impacted with having to access teachers. Our school, luckily for us, we did not have to, but we are losing critical funding that would support some of our students academically, whether it's through enrichment, Saturday programming, summer programming, and tutoring. And also there's other additional concerns that are across the board right now with teacher shortages and the quality of education that our youngsters are getting. So all these things are very concerning, but I think, now is the time to really get involved in. I'm going to talk few minutes about what the SLT is and the importance of it. It is governed by state law, New York state law, and also chancellor regulations that all New York City schools, public schools, must have a school leadership team. So we'll refer to it as SLT moving forward. This is a group comprised of the principal, the PTO president, the union rep at the school, as well as elected parents. And students can also be part of it and other community organizations. They meet on a monthly basis. The meetings have to be public. They should be announced on the school website with the time, as well as notes from the previous meetings. So really encourage parents to get involved, whether it's attending the meetings or actually running to sit on the SLT. And why it's so important is because this is a collective group of leaders in the school community that develop educational policy and make sure that the resources are allocated appropriately to support the needs of the school. Coming out of COVID and joining SLT during COVID, it was a very difficult time for everyone trying to navigate that as we're coming out of COVID and really starting to evaluate the progress of students and seeing where there are areas to troubleshoot, whether it's in extra support academically with ELA, math, or even also something that's very near and dear to me and to many of us are the social emotional needs of our children right now and all the stresses that they've had to deal with and how that's affecting their learning environment. That is also something that the SLT has in their jurisdiction to look at and how to support a collaborative culture in your own school. I think right now it's imperative that we really understand our school budgets from an individual standpoint. We have the right as parents and parents of students in our schools to ask these questions, to attend the meetings, to speak to SLT members, as well as also, collaboration with the PTO and the school, and really understanding what have been the immediate impacts of these budget cuts and what does that look like for our schools in the future. So I can't, reiterate enough that coming together and having access to these meetings is very important. I recently joined during COVID. I am so grateful for the parent leaders in our school that, sit there and really, put hours and hours of their time into understanding all of the needs in our particular schools. So I just wanted to reiterate how important it is. I think a lot of us might not know that the SLT has so much influence in our own individual communities in our schools. And that again trickles up as we come together collectively and connect with other leaders in our District 6 as well to see how we can support each other during these times.
Thank you,
I'm
Karina.
passing on to Kalidis.
Thank you, Kalidis. So we have been joined, I introduced her earlier in the program, but Kalidis, Dr. Kalidis Salas Ramirez, again, she is the Manhattan Borough appointee on the PEP, which is the Public Education Panel, or the Panel for Education Policy. I always forget PEP.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me into this space. So the Panel for Educational Policy is legally the New York City School Board. So while we have, in addition to the SLT, if we want to continue going through the hierarchy, we would move up to the Community Education Council, which are local school boards. And I see Luis Camilo here, who is part of CEC 6. And of course, our amazing moderator, Joanna Garcia, was president of CEC 6. We also, the Community Education Council informs policies to the panel for educational policy. Now, it has a little nickname because we are under mayoral control, which means that ultimately one person has the ability to govern what happens in our public schools. And so we have this body, this board, that has predominantly members that are appointed by the mayor. And then we have appointees throughout the city, one per borough president. And currently we have one elected member who is elected by the presidents of the community education councils. In the next 2 months, that will change. Actually, our panel is about to increase. Each borough will get their own representative elected by the presidents of the CECs in that space. And the mayor will also get an additional 4 members. Again, because there is mayoral control, the mayor gets additional appointees while the rest of us are underrepresented. But in that space, what we do is that we look at contracts, so how the money is spent. In order for us to be able to understand how the money is spent, there needs to be a budget. And so I'm sure Lainey spoke about the lawsuit. The panel for educational policy is supposed to deem an estimated budget that is appropriate to support what needs to happen to provide a quality education in our public schools. And so every month we meet. That meeting is also public. It adheres to open meetings laws. Currently, those meetings have been virtual. Mayor Adams has extended an executive order to continue meetings virtual until the end, until November 21st. So the next meeting is actually on November 30th, and we may actually be having our first in-person meeting since we started this administration, which will be in Queens. The meetings move around. In addition to contracts, we vote on utilization. So how are buildings utilized? If they are public school buildings, we vote on co-locations. So whether charter schools are coming into public school buildings. Recently, there was a conversation in your community about Wynn Charter School and Mott Hall and the reciting of Mott Hall and how that would impact your community. We also revise chancellor's regulations. And so if there's any sort of amendment in a chancellor's regulation, or if there's a new regulation that needs to be introduced, we deliberate on that before the meeting and then vote on it at the panel for educational policy. Several members of the panel are part of the Fair Student Funding Work Group, which is currently looking at how schools are funded. And so we hope, as Jasmine probably mentioned, to support a legislative move that the panel for educational policy would have to vote on in terms of how exactly we vote or how exactly we create budgets for our schools. And so I am the appointee for Mark Levine, the Manhattan Borough President, and I serve all of Manhattan. With that comes the responsibility of engaging not just CECs, president's councils, as well as superintendents and their teams, principals and teachers. And so I've tried to do my best to assess whether Manhattan schools have gotten their fair share of funding. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened. There's a lot of haves or have-nots in Manhattan, where we have a lot of schools in District 2 and in District 3 that have PAs or PTAs that can financially support the schools. That doesn't necessarily occur in Districts 1, 4, 5, and 6. And so I am happy to take any additional questions, but that's basically the gist of at least one space that parents can occupy in order to support any sort of changes in policy, as well as have conversations around school budgets. The way that it was presented to us this year, it was very matter-of-factly, and we didn't have an opportunity to actually deliberate on the budgets, and myself, as well as 3 other members that are borough president appointees, voted no on the estimated budget when presented to us. But the city wasn't as transparent and didn't provide. What I would say is that a lot of members come on and don't have, they aren't onboarded in a way where they can actually understand the nuance of this. And so it's really important for you to engage in these spaces and talk to legislators and talk to your community leaders about your school budgets, because there's a lot of nuance that can directly impact what happens in school communities. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salas Ramirez. And as you heard from both Karima and Kaliris, there are spaces that are already built so that you can have your voice in terms of what's going on with the budget, and so that you can also inform that process. We heard about the school leadership team, which, you know, as parent leaders, you get elected by your own parent association onto the school leadership team. And then there's the President's Council, which is representative of all the PAs, parent associations in a school district. And I'm going to ask Luis Camilo to briefly introduce himself and make a pitch for President's Council.
Sure. Thank you, Joanna. And thank you for having me. President's Council represents parent PTA president from, you're listening? I mean, can you hear me? Okay. So in District 6, there are 35, schools. 10 are middle schools, and there are, I believe, 5 intermediate schools that are like from pre-K all the way to 8th. And the rest are about 25. The rest are all elementary schools, grades mostly pre-K, sometimes 3K through 5th. And so in total, there's 35 that Superintendent Ramirez from District 6 supervises. So most of what the President's Council does is we meet monthly, and every school is required to have a PTA, either a PA or PTA. PA, it's strictly membership or parents. PTA, you also have teachers that are able to vote, in matters before, or agendas before the PTA. And so my school, for example, the Mott Hall School, is a PTA. So the teachers have also the same voting rights as the parents. And so most of what we do is we do networking and support parent leaders throughout the district. We maybe 3 or 4 times a year, we invite CBOs, community board organizations, we invite, in fact, Ms. Lainey Hansen, we generally invite her once a year to report to the district. I believe she was in our school around February or March this year. We invited Senator Jackson April of last year and this year as well, mostly to talk about the budget, since the state budget takes effect on April 1st every year. So normally we meet the 3rd Tuesday of the month, and Senator Jackson and his team, they report on what's in the budget. We also have parent leadership development and opportunities. We share best practices in terms of PTA fundraisers and what works best at schools. So we share it, so we support each other. And we also have, we advocate for, the schools throughout the district. We also meet, the CC sits, which I'm the IEP member. We meet with the superintendent quarterly, generally 3 times a year. We're supposed to meet in November, so it will most likely be December, because there's a lot going on this month coming up. And so we meet 3 times a year, November, usually December, then February, and then May. And we generally try to set priorities, and we talk to Manny. He's going to have a town hall November. I don't have the date in front of me, but there's a town hall that is going to be happening in the next few weeks, about 2 weeks, because we want parents to have a say about the direction of the district. When the superintendent was recently rehired and re-interviewed, President's Council had a major role, as well as CC6, in terms of who is hired. We chose to advocate for Manny to be rehired, because we know he has good ideas centering around STEMs, schools, and other areas. And so anyway, most of what we do also is we meet once a month on the 3rd Tuesday of the month. And although the executive board decides on, with the addition of the president on the agenda, but we also involve other parent leaders to also sometimes join in committees, so that, we have more than one select group, which is usually around 6 members on the executive board, to move any kind of ideas or let's say in our case, to have a goal for the year. This year, we're going to be talking about that at the November meeting. So I'll let Joanna know what the date that's going to be so that, more parents are involved.
Thank you. Liz.
Unfortunately, this year, I'll make it very brief. We have not had a lot of parental involvement. So that's going to be our main goal, to make sure parents come back to share their concerns in the district. And that's about it. As far as what Khalidi said, yes, CEC 6, they generally deal with zoning within the school. We have amendments, and resolutions that we, give to the DOE, and then ultimately they're approved by the PEP. So, given the time is so short, that's all I needed to say about the President's Council. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Louis. I'm sure that's a lot more than most people knew about President's Council before coming into this meeting. It's important that everyone knows the difference, again, spaces that parents have to be empowered. Just a quick note about across the board in terms of school governance. You heard about the President's Council, you heard about school leadership team, you heard about the CEC, you heard about the PEP, all these different acronyms. What's important to know is that all these bodies can pass resolutions, and you, the parent, the educator, the school community member, even if you don't sit on any of these bodies, you can communicate because they all ultimately represent your interest and your children's interests. So you can attend these meetings, you can send emails, you can reach out to the representatives that sit on the SLT, on the President's Council, on the CEC, and on the PEP, and say, I'm worried that my child's music teacher has to be let go. I'm worried that there isn't an after-school program. I'm worried that the budget doesn't seem to really connect with the goals of our school. And you can actually ask the body, let's take the CEC, for example, to express their will and actually pass a resolution that will be kicked up to the PEP, which is, as you heard, like the local school board, the school board for the city. And all these different bodies have different interactions, whether it be with the superintendent or with the school chancellors. So it's important, yes, that we participate as parents and members of this community, but it's also important to understand the power that you already have in shaping the policies and the conversation at these different levels of school governance. So with that, I am going to turn to questions. And so I'm going to hear from you some of the questions that were asked. And each year we are given the opportunity to complete school lunch applications. New York City schools receive funding when those applications are completed. Where in the budget would the DOE budget reflect funding received for school lunch applications? I am a vice president of CEC 6. This is Aisha Bruno, is also part of the district leadership team, and which is, yes, the district leadership team is part of the school governance. I just saw your question there. Who can answer about how the school lunch applications actually feed into the budget of the schools?
Joanna, the way it works is that when parents, fill the lunch application, they indicate what the household income is. And generally, that's how the school will determine if, let's say, that family, it's a Title I family, which is a federal program that tries to leverage, make equitable, to make sure that there's extra funding going. There's two types, the school-wide, initiative, and then you should have the targeted, targeted one, meaning targeted means that it's only a few parents, but most schools in District 6, there is the school-wide, meaning if one parent is at, Title I, all the parents are. And generally, by October 31st, the school PTA hosts a meeting to make sure there's an election for a PAC, Parent Advisory Council, and then you have a chair and an alternate. And the chair is part of the SLT. They're supposed to go monthly, just like the PTA president. And so that the point is that once the school, gets that information, they know, share with the federal government, with the New York State Education Department, DOE, and that they know which are, parents live, below the poverty line, because then that school
Yes.
normally gets extra funding.
Yes,
for the kids.
you're right, Louis. I think I'm gonna qualify Aisha's question. I think she wants to know if she was looking at the DOE budget,
Oh,
and I'm asking like Galides or Karima or even Lainey, because that was a good explainer, Louis. But where in the budget would you be able to see those federal dollars or that are reflected? How do you know what as a parent what you got as a result of the Title I or school lunch money?
So
What do you find?
Sarita posted in the chat the link to
Mhm.
the school allocation memo that specifically refers to the Title I funding that each school gets from the federal government. Every borough has a different threshold for schools having to reach for their poverty level to be able to access Title I funds. And I don't know exactly those levels, but I think it's about 60% families in poverty. Maybe Sarita knows the exact number. But it's really important that people fill out those forms, because if you reach that threshold, you get additional federal funds to your school. And Sarita put the link to the actual school allocation memo where you can see if your school receives Title I funds and how much.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, there are different cutoffs for each county, but yes, I do believe it's around 60%.
Thank you, Sarita. And Sarah Morgridge wanted to, and I think this was in response to Lainey's presentation, asking all of us to bear in mind that the historic overcrowding in District 6 has inflated the capacity numbers for many schools. A true measure of capacity would reveal many underutilized, quote unquote, schools without cluster and specialty rooms.
So that's absolutely true. In years when District 6 was very overcrowded, they converted a lot of specialty rooms to classroom space, and not all of them have been converted back to specialty rooms. But there is an additional column in the Blue Book that reflects how many extra specialty rooms every school should be getting. So that's something that District 6 needs to advocate for, is a more accurate reflection of overcrowding, so that their classrooms can be converted back to specialty rooms, which is not just art and music and science rooms, but also rooms for intervention services and the like.
Thank you. There's a question about the lawsuit. People just want clarity on what is the lawsuit and what's it all about. And there's I guess like a little sub question about who really is, what is the real reason why we do have budget cuts?
Well, it's a political decision on the part of the mayor to cut the budget, which he said reflects enrollment decline. But again, it's a political decision because we are flush with additional state and federal funds, as Jasmine pointed out. And our schools have been underfunded for generations. And last year was the first year where they were almost certainly, sufficiently funded to give kids what they need. The lawsuit was filed on behalf of 2 teachers and 2 parents in July on the basis of the fact that the state law clearly lays out an order by which first the panel for educational policy has to approve the DOE budget, and then it's supposed to go to the city council. This year and many years in the past, but not all of them, but many years in the past, the order has not been complied with. And in fact, almost every single year, the chancellor has put out an emergency declaration saying that because of the timing of all this, we need to send the money to schools according to the way he wants to do it now, before the city council or the PEP have had a chance to vote. And what the lawsuit showed is that there was no explanation for this emergency, that there was no emergency, and that many of the years the chancellor has claimed an emergency, there has been no emergency. And in fact, they just do this every year in order to get their way without any thought of public input or the legal requirement of votes. And so what the judge, Judge Lyle Frank, the Supreme Court judge, said, this is just boilerplate. This is a fiction. Every year you claim an emergency, but that's not legally allowed. And so he said the budget should have to be restored to last year's level, which happens if the city council does not properly approve a budget, until the city council revotes. And we know that the city council, many of them regretted their vote afterwards, when they've heard from their constituents about the impact of these budget cuts on schools, and would likely vote a different way. And in fact, they did pass a resolution a few months ago saying that they want the mayor to come back with them with a new proposal that restores the budget cuts, though the mayor has not done that. So we were very encouraged when we got that opinion from the Supreme Court judge, but then the city appealed. The appellate court heard the arguments in September, and they still have not ruled on the case. So I think it's quite unlikely, honestly, at this point, that they will order the budget cuts restored or a new vote of the city council, even though we would very much like them to do that. But we are going to talk in the next section about some action steps that might help with restoring that budget through a political mechanism instead.
Okay, thank you. Jasmine, did you have anything to add? I have another question from, I'm just checking in with you because I know you spoke about the budget as well.
No, but I think Caleris has something to add.
Yes, go ahead, Caleris.
Yes, so a couple of things. One thing that's super important that not all parents remember, because all New York City kids are eligible for free lunch. The lunch forms are really important for schools to be able to have an accurate assessment about what kids actually meet these needs, and that a school community is eligible for these particular additional funds with children that are eligible for free lunch based on their family income. So it's really important for communities to submit those forms. The other thing that I will say about Title I is that CECs are organizing, because now that our communities are gentrifying, some of our schools are losing Title I funding, because now we have middle-class families that don't meet eligibility for the free reduced lunch. And so one of the things that you could engage your CECs on, as well as your President's Council, is a resolution that would support some transitional funds and trying to figure out how to tap into other federal resources so that schools are able to manage these budget cuts in a realistic way. Next year, we will only receive a quarter of the federal stimulus funding. And while we have the money now, one of the arguments that the city has used is that we need to transition into having this less money. It doesn't work for this year because we actually have the money and they could have reinstated the cuts, and we could actually be talking about a plan on how to better support our schools as we start seeing the decrease in federal funding. That's not what's happening with this administration. And so that's another thing that we as parents have to continue to elevate, that the city has the money, that we could have a plan in place to support our schools, and that we can actually contribute and engage our communities to figure out exactly what it is that they need as we move these conversations forward. Thank you.
And I did just want to add one thing. Yes, Title I is important and we want our schools to get that money. But the majority of aid that goes to schools really comes from between the state and the city funds. And so, yes, we should fight for the federal government to give us the dollars we need. We should make sure our schools receive the Title I designation that they're supposed to have. But also, if your school, like the students are on free and reduced price lunch, it also drives more fair student funding, the city's formula, to your school as well. And the bulk of the funding that your school gets actually comes from mostly the city dollars. And so I just want to put that in context that yes, the federal money is a lot and it feels really big, but at the end of the day, overall, federal funds just make up 10% of our school budget, like 40 or 30 from the state, and the rest comes from the city's budget.
Thank you, Jasmine. One final question before we go into action steps. Taiba Ahmad asked, what can we do if our SLT finance chair, who is our school principal, does not share the budget with the SLT? And I believe Senator Jackson would like to answer this question. Senator Jackson?
Sorry, Jay, can you, what was the question again?
Yes. So what can we do if our SLT finance chair is our school principal and does not share the budget with the SLT?
Well, principals are not dictators. Quite frankly, that's why you have the school leadership team, in order to communicate with the team about what the budget is and talk about what the needs of the school is. The principal does not have it all. That's why you have a leadership team. That's why you have a superintendent. Because if in fact you ask to see the budget and the principal refuses, then there's an appeal process that you should go to the superintendent and say, we're trying to assess the budgetary situation as to the needs of our students. And the principal is not willing to share that with the team so we can work as in unity. I think that the superintendent will put the principal in his or her place.
Thank you. So we are gonna end promptly at 7:30, and which means we're gonna go through some action steps that Lane is gonna go through, and you're definitely gonna get a toolbox. But before that, I would be remiss if I didn't give Carmen Rojas 1 or 2 minutes to see if she wants to share anything or say anything or even ask a question. She is a panelist. She's a longtime advocate of PAN and a parent advocate in District 6. Carmen?
Sí, buenas noches.
Buenas noches, Carmen. Dinos si tiene alguna pregunta o algún comentario. Tenemos unos 2 minutos antes de hablar sobre los próximos pasos para cerrar. Dime.
Yo quiero, o sea, oí hablar de todo, de presupuesto, de muchísimas cosas, pero me preocupa que no tengan una línea clara y específica de cómo volvemos nosotros a apasionar a nuestros padres para que ellos tomen control dentro de lo que es la educación de sus hijos, porque todo el mundo, el alcalde, el superintendente, todo el mundo está tomando decisiones sobre qué es la educación de nuestros niños y nos lo informan a nosotros después que ya ellos tomaron las decisiones. Y para mí es muy preocupante que los padres no estemos participando activamente en la educación de nuestros hijos.
Gracias, Carmen. Yo voy a traducir porque Marta no creo que puede. So I'm going to translate quickly what Carmen, again, she is a longtime advocate. She's been doing advocacy for a very long time, especially in District 6. She heard a great deal about the budget and she heard all the comments and questions around it. Her major concern is the parent advocacy piece. She fears there needs to be more fire and energy and passion behind parents in terms of a need to be involved in the education overall in District 6 and in their children's education. Too often we hear that the mayor and the chancellor and other high ups are making decisions for our children's education after the fact. And as parents, we all have to step up and get involved. Gracias, Carmen. Thank you, Carmen.
Okay.
So I'm gonna turn now to Lainey. Lainey, can you talk about, because and this actually is a direct response to what Carmen had just mentioned, where we talked about the cuts. We know that our schools are hurting for more funding. What do we do as parents? Where's the advocacy? We talked about getting involved in the different school governance, reaching out to those that represent you, resolutions, but there are future cuts that could make things even more dire, worse, are for our children and our schools and our educators. So our schools really need us, as State Senator Robert Jackson mentioned early in the program. So Lainey, can you please tell us what is an action that we can take right away?
Right. Well, first of all, we have a budget survey posted both in Spanish and in English, and you can see the links on your screen there, and I can also put them in the chat to try to figure out what is the impact of these budget cuts on your school, to help us all advocate for the budget cuts to be restored. What has it meant in terms of larger class sizes, loss of counselors, loss of music and art programs? We really would like to know what's happening in your school. We also have advocacy tools around the need for a task force that I described before, to make sure that the laws actually complied with and that schools actually get smaller classes in the end. We have a sign-on letter for CECs, president's councils, other organizations at the link. And I think Aaron is putting the link in the chat, and you're going to also get an email with these links, hopefully. And also we have a draft resolution on this for your organization, either your President's Council, your CEC, or whatever other organization. Even SLTs and PTAs can pass this resolution. The Chancellor's Parent Advisory Council has passed it, as several CECs have already passed it, and more are in the process of passing the resolution. Because I believe that if we don't get a task force, the DOE just simply doesn't want to comply and is not going to go ahead and reduce class sizes. Specifically around the budget cuts, we have drafted now a city council pledge. We don't have the link here, but we will create the link for you, that we would like you to send to your city council member. And what the pledge does is certain boxes that they can check off. There's going to be a mid-year budget modification. City council members, some of them are talking already about agreeing not to approve any mid-year budget modification that the mayor puts forward unless the budget cuts to schools are restored. And so that's one of the things that we're going to ask city council members to promise, and also not to promise future cuts to budgets in the future, budgets for next year and the year after. No more budget cuts to schools. And one of the ways we will know whether this happens or not is we're also asking them to create a separate budget allocation line for school level budgets, which we've never had. So there are all these various allocation lines in the DOE budget, but there's not one that actually reflects what schools get. And that's one of the reasons so many people were very surprised at the budget cuts this year, because it's not reflected in the overall budget that the city council votes on every year. So those are some of the things. And finally, we're also asking if they promise not to approve any school capital plan that doesn't clearly and transparently have the space, enough space to make the benchmarks in the new class size reduction law. And there, I've added my email there, info@classsizematters.org. If you have any questions about any of this, the slides, I've realized the bottom that was cut off, the bottom was there in my original slides, but not in the posted slides for some reason. So you'll get to see all those slides. I'll also send you my slides. So we will have a link to that city council pledge. And what we're going to be asking all parents to do is send that link to their city council member and ask them to sign on to this pledge. And hopefully many of them will, and that will generate a lot more resistance against allowing future schools to be cut in the future, and also pushing for many of these budget cuts to be restored.
Thank you, Lainey, and thank you, everyone. So I really want to just remind everyone that that link Delaney spoke about in terms of access to the pledge and everything else that you see there, including a copy of the presentation today in English and in Spanish, including a link to the recording of this conversation will be emailed to everyone that registers. So you're going to have that. I also want to remind you what we're talking about here. We're talking about city cuts. The city council and the city will be tasked with figuring out whether or not they're going to accept additional cuts in terms of the budget modification this November. That's how soon it is. And that's why it's really important that you send the pledge to your city council member to make sure that your city council member does not approve further cuts to our schools. And then, just so you know, and this is important, the city begins to deliberate over the budget for all of our city agencies, including the Department of Education, in February. These hearings are public. The DOE will tell you, if you're looking at it, and if you listen to the advocates that you have here, what cuts they're thinking of making. You just gotta pay attention and never be afraid to ask questions. And that's why we're so thankful for the panelists that are here today. I cannot stress enough how important it is to stay connected with parent leaders, like on your school leadership team, your representative and your advocate on the PEP, like Kaliris. AQE is so fierce in really organizing and advocating for parents. With Lainey Haston, Class Size Matters. The data is always there. You can count on Lainey to really provide that data. And then you have President's Council, then you have CEC, and you have longtime advocates like Carmen Rojas. And of course, you have longtime champion for public education, Senator Robert Jackson, who's gonna close us out. Senator Jackson.
Well, thank you, Joanna, and thank you everyone for participating this evening. I really appreciate this is something for me to go through on a continuous basis, because like anything else, you have to constantly refocus what you're doing, and especially in an environment that's constantly changing. So you have to hit the target, and the target is the mayor of New York City, the chancellor, and the legislators at the local level that basically could, make the decision to restore the cuts and do battle with whoever is in the way. And if necessary to go to court, you go to court. If it's necessary to walk 150 miles, I'm willing to walk with you. We have to do what we have to do to make sure that the funds are there in our school, to make sure that every child has an opportunity for a good education. That's what this is about. So don't be afraid. Stand up, fight back. Thank you.
Thank you, and we're here with you all. Feel free to reach out to us, and you'll get the contact information for everyone on this panel. Again, thank you, and have a good night. Gracias, thank you, panelists.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.